They sent Calla Dren out of Whitmore's office on a Tuesday in late September with a settlement of $11 and a letter of release that said she was not suited to the demands of professional correspondence. She did not argue with the letter. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket and walked the 4 blocks to the post office to check whether the reply had come in from Soll Ranch up in the Carver Valley. It had. She read it on the sidewalk, folded it in thirds the same way she folded everything, and went home to pack her trunk. She was 37 years old, and she had worked for Whitmore Land and Title for 9 years. In those 9 years, she had drafted 143 easement agreements, 61 property transfer instruments, and more deed riders than she had bothered to count. Whitmore had signed every one of them with his heavy engraved pen and submitted them under his own name. When the county seat brought in a new clerk who had attended 2 years of actual law school, Whitmore decided he no longer needed Calla Dren. He did not let her go quietly. He walked her to the door of the neighboring land office and told the man there, a person named Grabble, that she was available and that her wages were negotiable and that she was thorough, if a little slow. Grabble looked at her the way men like Grabble looked at women brought to their doors by men like Whitmore, and said he had no current need. Whitmore gave her $11, which was what he calculated she was owed for the partial month, and wrote the letter about professional correspondence and did not look at her when he handed it over. She had walked out of that office knowing she would not go back, and also knowing that 9 years of work had been handed off for nothing. Her name on none of it, her skill reduced to a line about correspondence in a dismissal letter. She had stood on the sidewalk outside Grabble's office for a moment with the $11 in her coat pocket and the letter folded on top of them, and she had thought, without drama, that she had been useful to a man who had not been useful to her, and that this was the accounting, and she was done with it. The advertisement at the post office had been there when she went to mail her notice of departure to the rooming house she had been renting. She read it twice, went home, wrote the reply, and came back to mail both envelopes at once. She had not known what Soll Ranch was, or what the Carver Valley looked like, or whether the man who wrote the advertisement was the kind of man who asked his questions plainly. She had known that the advertisement said land instruments and not general correspondence, and that whoever had written it had not wasted a word. The advertisement had said that Soll Ranch in the Carver Valley required a person with clerical experience and some familiarity with land instruments. It said room and board and a wage of $18 a month. It did not say anything else, because the man who wrote it, Breck Soll, was not a man who said things he did not need to say. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early October, when the aspens on the upper slopes had gone fully gold, and the air at that elevation had the clean, flat smell of coming cold. The wagon that collected her from the road junction was driven by a hand named Pete Garrow, who said almost nothing for 6 miles, and then said the ranch was just ahead, and Calla said she could see that, and they said nothing else for the remaining quarter mile. Breck Soll was standing at the corral fence when the wagon came in. He was 44 years old, and he was built the way men built by ranch work are built, with no softness anywhere and a particular quality of stillness that was not laziness but economy. He watched the wagon come in the way he watched everything, with attention and without hurry, when Calla climbed down from the wagon seat without waiting for Pete Garrow to offer a hand. Breck Soll noticed that too. He said her name as a question, Calla Dren, and she said yes, and he said Breck Soll, and put out his hand, and she shook it the way she shook all hands, firmly and once, and then done. He told her he would show her the office. She followed him across the yard. The office was a room off the main house. A small room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked out over the south pasture. On the table was a stack of documents that stood 8 inches high. He stood in the doorway and looked at the stack and then at her. He said he had some paper that needed attention. She said she could see that. He said some of it was pressing and some of it was less pressing, and he could not always tell which was which. She asked if she could have until morning. He said she could have until morning. She was at the table by lamplight until past 11 that night, working through the stack in the order that made sense to her, which was not the order it had arrived in, and not the order it was stacked in, but the order of consequence. The things that would cost him the most if left unaddressed at the top, and the things that could wait another few weeks at the bottom. When she went to bed, she had a list in her pocket, and she knew what it said, and she did not need to look at it again. Breck Soll found her in the kitchen at 5:30 the next morning. She had the list on the table and a cup of coffee, and she was looking out the window at the pasture. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, and she slid the list across to him. He looked at the list for a long moment. Then he said, "What does it say at the top?" She had been told by men with better educations than his that she said things too directly, that she did not soften enough, that her manner was abrupt. She looked at him and said he was about to lose 60 acres of his east grazing land to a water rights transfer he had agreed to, without understanding what he agreed to, and that the agreement had to be formally contested within 30 days or it would stand. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how much time they had. She said 22 days. He asked if she could write the contest. She said she already had. He looked at her over his coffee cup, and she could not read exactly what was in his face, but it was not what she was accustomed to from men who had just been told their land was at risk. It was not anger, and it was not deflection. It was something more like the particular attention of a man who has just realized he is in the presence of someone who knows what they are doing. He said he would need to read it before it went out. She pushed a second paper across to him. He took it and read it, and she watched him read it, and after a few minutes he looked up and said it was good. She said she knew. This is Dusty Vows, where Calla Dren arrived at Soll Ranch in the Carver Valley with $11 to her name, and a stack of land instruments nobody else had bothered to read, and found a man who had been losing ground quietly for years without knowing how to stop it. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now. Then back to the kitchen table and the list that was about to change everything. Breck Soll had been running the Carver Valley operation for most of his adult life. He had started with 220 acres left to him by his father, land that had been worked hard and maintained poorly, and he had grown it by careful work and the kind of patience that most men could not sustain. It stood now at 480 acres, with a small herd of mixed cattle, and a hay yield that came in reliably in good years. He was not a rich man, but he was not a poor one, and the ranch showed the care of a man who thought about what he was building, and then built it without cutting the corners that would have made things easier in the short run and worse in the long one. What he could not do, and had never been able to do, was read legal language. He could read a ledger if the numbers were plain and the categories were clear. He could read a supply invoice and a weather report and a hands-written notice of departure. But legal instruments, the instruments with their whereases and their heretofore-mentioned parties, and their subordinate clauses folded inside subordinate clauses, those defeated him completely and always had. He had managed for years by asking the county clerk to read things aloud to him, but the county clerk was a man named Horace Druell, who liked the sound of his own importance, and had a habit of summarizing rather than reading precisely. And the water rights transfer that Calla Dren had found in the stack had gone through exactly that way, with Breck Soll's signature on a document that Horace Druell had described as a standard mutual access instrument. And that was in fact a graduated transfer of riparian rights that would take 60 acres of his east pasture grazing access off him in 3 years. He did not tell Calla Dren any of this directly, but she had read enough instruments to know what she was looking at, and she had been in the room with enough men like Horace Druell to understand how a man like Breck Soll could have ended up with his signature on something he did not understand. She did not say so. It was not her job to say so. Her job, as far as she understood it, was to read the paper and tell him what it said and write what needed to be written. She started doing that the morning she arrived, and she did not stop. The water rights contest went out by post on day 3. She drafted it in the form she knew the county examiner preferred, with the contested provision quoted directly and the grounds for contest enumerated in plain language, because she had found that county examiners were not substantially different from all other readers and preferred to understand a document on the first pass. She wrote a cover letter to accompany it and sealed the envelope herself and gave it to Pete Garrow to take to the junction, and she did not mention it again, because there was nothing to add until a response came back. While the contest was pending, she worked through the rest of the stack with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything since the first night. There was a grazing lease renewal due to the north, with a man named Lester Cord, who had inserted new language into the renewal that would have allowed him to run cattle on Soll land during Cord's own calving season. A provision buried in the third paragraph of the rider where a careless reader would not have found it until it was already operative. She struck the new language with 2 clean lines and wrote a replacement clause that said precisely what the original agreement had said, and nothing more. She wrote a cover note to Cord that was courteous and specific, and left no room for negotiation on that particular point. There was an old promissory note from 7 years prior that had been incorrectly discharged, the discharge language referencing a parcel description that did not match the parcel in the original note, which meant the note was technically still active. It was a quiet vulnerability, the kind that no one noticed until someone decided to look. She drafted a corrected discharge document with the proper parcel description and flagged it for Breck Soll's review with a note explaining what the error was and what it could eventually cost if left uncorrected. There was a boundary survey from 11 years ago that described a fence line running from the northwest corner marker to a creek junction, but the actual fence on the ground ran 6 feet south of where the survey said it ran. She went out to look at the fence herself on a cold morning in the second week, walking the line with the survey in one hand and making notes in the other, and came back with a memorandum describing the discrepancy and what it would take to file a corrected survey before the matter became someone else's leverage. Breck Soll read everything she put in front of him. He read slowly, and he asked questions when he did not understand a term, and she answered the questions without ceremony. She had noticed, within the first week, that he was not a man who pretended to understand something he did not understand, and that this was rarer than it should have been. Most men she had worked with or worked around preferred confusion over the appearance of not knowing. They would nod at a term they could not define, and then act on a misunderstanding of it later, and call it something other than ignorance when the consequence arrived. Breck Soll asked his questions as if the answers were simply information he needed and had not yet acquired. She found this easier to work with than she had expected. It also made her answers matter in a way that Whitmore's silent nodding never had. The first time she went out to the east pasture, it was to walk the land the water rights transfer had threatened. She wanted to see the ground before the response came back from the county examiner to understand what was at stake as something more concrete than acreage on a document. She went on a Saturday morning, on foot, with a notebook and the survey map she had found in the stack. The east pasture ran along a seasonal creek that fed from the higher slope, and the grass there was thick right up to the bank, and the soil had the dark color of ground that held its water well. She walked the full length of the creek boundary, nearly a mile, stopping at intervals to make notes on what she observed. The water table was closer to the surface here than on the west pasture. The grass coming back after summer grazing was stronger. The soil held its structure even at the bank edge. She stood at the north end of the boundary and looked back down the line and understood, in the specific way that came from standing on a thing rather than reading about it, exactly what would be lost if the transfer stood. She came back and added 3 paragraphs to the contest brief that she sent by follow-up post 2 days later. The paragraphs described the hydrological characteristics of the east pasture boundary in specific terms, with reference to the survey map coordinates, and argued that the riparian rights being transferred were not separable from the surface grazing rights, in the way the transfer instrument assumed, because the water access was what made the grazing viable. It was the strongest section of the brief, and she knew it when she wrote it. Breck Soll had seen her go out with the notebook that Saturday morning. He had not said anything when she left, and he had not said anything when she came back. He was at the corral in the afternoon when she crossed the yard, and she stopped and told him what she had added to the brief, and why. He listened with his arms on the top rail and his eyes on the pasture beyond her, and when she finished he said she was right about the soil. She said she knew. He looked at her then with the quality of attention she had first seen at the kitchen table, and then looked back at the pasture, and she went inside. The response from the county examiner came back in the third week of October. It was favorable. The transfer was suspended pending a formal hearing, and the hearing date was set for mid-December. She read the response twice to be certain she had the date correct, then knocked on the door of the main room where Breck Soll was reviewing supply tallies. She told him the contest had been received, and the hearing was set, and they had a good position. He put the supply tally down on the table. He said thank you. She said she would start the hearing preparation as soon as she had cleared the cord rider. He said that would be fine. She went back to the office. Calla said she would move directly from one task to the next, without pausing to let the good news settle, and Breck said that would be fine without asking her to slow down or mark the moment. What did that small agreement reveal about these two people? About whether they were built the same way? About whether either of them had ever before found someone who moved at the same pace without being asked to? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. Now back to the Carver Valley in late October, when the weather had changed and the work kept coming. The cold came down properly in the last week of October, and the mornings went from brisk to something harder, and the light shifted to the flat gray-white of high country autumn. Calla had not brought enough warm clothes, a miscalculation she remedied by asking Pete Garrow where the nearest dry goods was, and going there on her first free Saturday. She came back with 2 wool flannel shirts and a heavier coat, and a pair of gloves with no fingers so she could still hold a pen. She did not make any announcement about any of it. She hung the coat on the hook by the office door and put the shirts in her room, and wore the fingerless gloves from the following Monday without comment. Breck Soll noticed the coat on the hook. He noticed the gloves. He did not say anything about either of them. What he did instead, which she noticed in turn, was move the wood stove in the office 6 inches closer to the table. He did it on a Sunday while she was out on the cord pasture boundary, checking the fence description against the actual ground. She came back and saw the stove had moved, and she understood what it meant without needing to think about it, and she said nothing about it either. November built its own rhythm, and she settled into it the way she settled into work she intended to stay with. She was at the table by 5:30 every morning, and coffee was already on the stove when she got there, which had been true since the first week. She had registered it the first morning as something she should not depend on, and had been depending on it ever since without acknowledging that she was. She worked until the light was poor, and then she stopped working, because she had learned long ago that working past the useful point was not discipline but waste. She came to the supper table, and they ate and talked about what needed talking about, and did not talk about what did not. The days had a cleanness to them that she recognized. It was the cleanness of work that was real and consequential, of a situation in which what she did mattered in terms she could see directly. The cord rider was sent and acknowledged. The promissory note discharge was signed and filed. The boundary survey memorandum went to the county office for review. Every week the stack on the table was smaller than it had been the week before, and the operation was in better order because of it, and she could trace the line from what she had done to the order that resulted, and there was no one standing between her and that line. Breck Soll had a hand named Reeves, who could not read at all, and a hand named Pete Garrow, who could read but slowly and without confidence, stopping at long words and sometimes guessing at them rather than asking what they said. And there was a young man who came on Thursdays named Cobb, who was 15, and being given board and small wages while his father recovered from a broken leg up at the North Boundary Camp. She had noticed in the second week that Cobb was interested in the papers on her table, in the way that a boy interested in something he cannot access is interested in it, with a sidelong attention he thought was invisible, and a habit of lingering near the office door when he had no particular reason to be there. She started leaving a copy of the previous week's county notices on the corner of the table on Thursday mornings before Cobb arrived. She put them where he could reach them and did not say anything about it to him or to anyone else. He picked them up the first Thursday and set them down again. The second Thursday, he stood at the corner of the table and read one notice through and put them back without saying anything. By the third Thursday, he was sitting on the stool in the corner of the office, with the notices in his lap, working through the words, stopping occasionally and looking up with an expression that meant he had encountered something he could not get through. She answered his questions the same way she answered Breck Soll's questions, without ceremony and without the particular adjustment that some adults made when teaching the young, the slowing down and simplifying that carried in it the implication that the question was evidence of inadequacy. His questions were the same kind of questions Breck Soll's were. Questions about what a word meant or what a provision required, and she answered them the same way, with the information needed and nothing added to it. She was aware that Breck Soll had seen this. He came through the office on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of November to leave a supply note on her table, and Cobb was on the stool with the county notices, working out a word aloud under his breath. Breck Soll put down the supply note and stood for a moment and looked at the boy and looked at her and then went back out. She heard the door close. She understood what it meant that he had not said anything. The December hearing was 2 weeks out when Lester Cord came to the ranch himself. She had not expected him to come in person, but she had prepared for the possibility. He was a large man in his late 50s, with the manner of a man accustomed to filling a room and deciding in advance what a conversation was going to be. He came into the yard on a cold Tuesday morning and asked for Breck Soll, and Pete Garrow went and got him, and they stood in the yard talking. She watched from the office window. She could not hear the words, but she could read from the positions of the two men that Cord was not there to resolve anything amicably. His weight was forward, and his arms were moving. After 12 minutes, Breck Soll came to the office door and said Cord wanted to discuss the boundary rider. She said she would come out. Cord looked at her the way men like Cord looked at women who came out of offices at ranches, with a brief and conclusive assessment that placed her into a category that did not require further consideration. He directed his first question to Breck Soll. Breck Soll said she was the one to ask. Cord adjusted. He said he had some questions about the language in the document he had received. She said she would be glad to discuss it. He said the document was overcomplicated, and she said she would be glad to discuss which part he found unclear. He said all of it was unclear, and she said she would start at the beginning then. She went through the rider clause by clause in the yard in the cold, with her breath making small white shapes in the air. And she answered every question Cord put to her without stepping back from any of it. He asked why the calving provision had been struck, and she explained that it had not been in the original agreement, and so had no standing in the renewal. He said it had been his understanding that the original agreement allowed for seasonal flexibility, and she said the original agreement used the word flexibility in no form, and she could provide the original text if he wished to compare them. He said the language she had written in the replacement clause was narrower than what he had agreed to, and she said the replacement clause reproduced the operative provisions of the original agreement with precision, and that if he felt the original agreement was itself too narrow, that was a matter for a new negotiation rather than an insertion into the renewal rider, and that she would be glad to facilitate that new negotiation in writing if he wished to make a formal proposal. Cord looked at Breck Soll. Breck Soll said he thought the document was clear. Cord said he would have his own man look at it. She said she would be glad to respond to any written questions his man had. Cord looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both, and then he got back in his wagon and left without saying anything further. Breck Soll stood in the yard after the wagon was out of sight and said that Cord had not expected that. She said most people did not expect a thorough answer to a question they had hoped was rhetorical. He looked at her with something in his face she had not seen directed at her before, and did not have a name for, and then went back to the corral. Breck Soll stood in the yard for a moment after the wagon pulled out. Then he came back to the office door and said she had handled that well. She said the rider was sound. He said he knew. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was needed to say either of those things, and then he went back to the corral. She sat down at the table and looked at the document she had been working on before Cord arrived, and read the sentence she had left off at, and picked up the pen, and went back to work. There were small things she noticed that she did not mention, and that she understood he did not expect her to mention. He left a lamp burning in the main room on the evening she worked late, even when he had gone to bed, so that the walk from the office to the house was not in full dark. She noticed it the first time it happened and said nothing, and the lamp was there again the next time and the time after that. She could have found her way across the yard in the dark without difficulty. That was not the point, and she understood it was not the point. He had a habit, when she handed him a document to review, of reading the full page before he said anything, even when she had already summarized what it contained. She noticed this in the first week, and understood after the second week that he did it because he wanted his assessment to be his own, and not a response to her framing. She respected this without saying so. It was the same instinct that made her walk the east pasture before she wrote about it. There was a mare in the far corral who had come back from the north boundary camp with a bad leg, and she watched through the office window in the second week of November as Breck Soll worked with the animal every morning before breakfast, not forcing anything, not hurrying, standing at the edge of the mare's space and waiting for the mare to decide what she could tolerate. It took 4 mornings before the mare let him close enough to work on the leg properly. She watched all 4 mornings from the window and said nothing about any of it. But she thought about it in the context of other things she had observed, and the pattern was consistent, and she filed it in the same place she filed the lamp, and the questions asked plainly, and the stove moved without announcement. Pete Garrow told her one afternoon, in the way Pete Garrow told things, which was sideways and without looking directly at the person he was telling them to, that the previous person who had tried to manage the ranch paperwork had been a man from down in the flatlands who had lasted 6 weeks before deciding the elevation was bad for his constitution. She asked what the elevation had to do with the paperwork, and Pete Garrow said nothing, and she understood that the paperwork had had nothing to do with it, and that the man had simply not been suited to the work and had found the elevation a more dignified explanation. She was not going to have that problem. She was suited to the work. She had always been suited to this specific kind of work, the reading and the drafting and the argument laid out in precise sequence, the understanding of what a document actually said versus what the person presenting it wanted you to believe it said. She had been suited to it at Whitmore's, and she was suited to it here, and the difference was that here it was hers, and what it protected was visible from the office window on clear days. The south pasture and the east pasture and the ridgeline above them and the creek she had walked in October. She had spent 9 years writing documents that bore another man's name. She had done it without complaint because complaint was not useful, and she understood the situation she was in. She was a woman in a territory where women did not hold professional positions except as a convenience to men who needed work done without paying the full professional wage for it. She had known this when she took the Whitmore position, and she had known it every year she stayed. In the early years, she had told herself it was temporary. Then, she had stopped telling herself that and told herself it was sufficient instead. The work was real even if the credit was not. The documents were sound. The land stayed where it was supposed to stay, and the water went where it was supposed to go, and the titles held, and the easements were defensible, and she had done that, even if the record said Whitmore had. The $11 in the letter were his final accounting of what that amounted to. She had not let herself be angry about it in September, because anger was not useful. But sitting at Breck Soll's table in November, with the writer she had written under her own hand, and Cobb reading in the corner, and the stack diminishing week by week, she felt the distance between where she was and where she had been as something measurable. Not happiness, which was too large and uncertain a word, something more specific. The work bore her name now. The man she worked for knew the difference between what she produced and what someone less careful would have produced, and he said so in the direct, plain way he said things, without inflation and without qualification. She was not invisible here. She was not a convenience. She was the reason the east pasture was still whole, and the promissory note was properly discharged, and Lester Cord had driven away without the calving provision. She put the pen down for a moment and looked at the south pasture through the window. The light was low and winter flat, and the grass had gone dry and pale, She looked at it until she had looked at it enough. Then she picked the pen back up. The December hearing was on a Thursday. She had prepared 2 binders of supporting documentation and a written statement of position that she had revised 4 times. Not because the first version was wrong, but because each revision made it harder to misread and easier to cite. The 4th version was the one she bound, and she knew before she bound it that it was as sound as anything she had ever produced. She and Breck Soll drove to the county seat on a morning cold enough that the horse's breath came in long rolling shapes, and the road was hard with the first real frost. It was a 2-hour journey, and she read through her notes for the first half, and then set them in her lap and watched the land go by. The high country in December had a particular quality, stripped back to its structure, the aspens bare and the meadow grasses bent flat, the ridgelines clean against a sky that was the same pale gray-white as the frost on the ground. She had grown up in a lower country, and had not known until this October that she preferred the elevation. Breck Soll said at some point, without preamble, that he appreciated the work she had done on the East Pasture matter. She said it was a strong position, and she expected it to hold. He said he was not talking about the position. He was talking about the fact that she had gone out and walked the land before she wrote the supplement to the brief. He said most people who worked with paper did not do that. She considered this for a moment, and then said she had found it was hard to write accurately about land you had not stood on. He said he had found the same was true about most things worth saying anything about. She looked at the road ahead of them, and he looked at the road ahead of them, and neither of them said anything else for several miles. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence between them, a small and definite change, and she was aware of it the way she was aware of things she had been noticing for a while without naming. The hearing went as she had prepared it to go. The county examiner was a woman she had not expected, a precise and attentive person named Hilda Vort, who had evidently read both submissions carefully and came to the session with specific questions already marked in the margins of her copy. Calla answered the questions from memory, citing page and clause without referring to her binders. And Breck Soll sat beside her at the table and did not need to say anything, because she had made it so he did not need to. The contesting party's representative was a younger man from a land office 2 counties over, who had prepared adequately but not thoroughly, and who made the mistake in the second hour of suggesting that the original signatory had understood the terms of the transfer at the time of signing. Calla said, without raising her voice, that she could demonstrate from 3 distinct provisions in the instrument itself that the language had been constructed to obscure its operative effect, and that she would be glad to do so. The county examiner said she would be glad to hear it. Calla opened to the first provision and read it aloud and then restated it in plain terms. The first provision defined the transferred rights using a term that appeared to mean surface water access, but was defined elsewhere in the instrument, in a footnote on the 4th page, to include subsurface water rights below a specified depth. She cited the page and footnote number and read both aloud. The examiner made a note. The second provision established the transfer schedule as graduated over 3 years, which the contesting party's representative had characterized as a courtesy provision allowing the signatory to adjust operations gradually. Calla said the 3-year schedule was not a courtesy, but a mechanism. It meant the transfer would be complete before the first renewal of the grazing lease on the adjacent parcel, so that by the time the lease came due for renewal, the water rights would already be gone, and the lease terms would have to be renegotiated without them. She said this was not an incidental feature of the drafting. The examiner made a second note. The third provision required the signatory to provide written notice within 60 days of signing if he wished to contest any term, but the instrument had been presented to the signatory as a standard renewal form, and the 60-day window had passed before anyone had occasion to read it carefully. She said she was not in a position to characterize the intent of the original drafter. She said she could characterize the effect. The examiner said that was sufficient and made a third note and asked the contesting party's representative if he wished to respond. He said he would need time to consult his records. The examiner said the record would reflect that no response was offered, The session concluded with a ruling in Breck Soll's favor and a notation in the county record that the original transfer instrument had been improperly presented to the signatory. They drove back in the late afternoon with the winter sun sitting flat and gold on the upper slopes and the valley below already in shadow. She was tired in the particular way she was tired after a sustained effort. Not depleted, but emptied out, all the preparation spent and the outcome known, and nothing left to do but let the distance pass. At Whitmore, she had prepared cases for him to present, and had sat in the back of the room if she was permitted in the room at all, and had heard the rulings go the way she had written them to go, and had watched Whitmore accept the credit with the heavy pen-signed authority he wore like a coat. She had never sat at the table before. She had sat at the table today and cited her own documentation from memory, and the examiner had said the record would reflect that no response was offered. And she was tired now in a way that was entirely different from the tiredness of watching someone else receive what you had built. She sat with her hands in her lap and did not read and did not review. She watched the light on the hills until the light was gone. Breck Soll said, after they had been driving for a good while, that he owed her an honest account of something. She said all right. He said he had known, when he ran the advertisement at the post office, that he needed someone who could read the paper better than he could. He said he had not put it in those terms in the advertisement, because he had not wanted to advertise his limitation. He said he had tried for 2 years before that to manage the paper himself, with Horace Drool reading things aloud and his own best attempt at following along. And the water rights transfer had been the result of that system, and he had not known it was the result until she arrived and told him what was in the stack. He said that was the practical part. She said she had understood that much from the first morning. He said he knew she had. He said that was one of the things he had been thinking about since October, the fact that she had understood it from the first morning and had not said so, had simply addressed what needed addressing without making him account for how it had come to be there. She said it was not her job to make him account for it. He said he knew that too. He said most people would have done it anyway. She considered this and said that most people spent considerable energy on the accounting and not enough on the addressing, and that she had always found this a poor allocation. He was quiet for a moment and then said that was exactly what he meant. He said the other part was that he had read her reply letter 3 times and had known from the letter that she was more than adequately skilled, and had also known from the quality of the letter that whoever had let her go for $11 and a letter about correspondence had passed her off for nothing and called it a fair accounting. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the 9 years and the documents and the letter, and then she thought about the stack on the table when she arrived, and the east pasture whole and legally secured, and Cobb reading in the corner on Thursday afternoons. She said she had been told she was slow. He said he knew. He said he had gathered that. She asked how he had gathered it. He said that the particular kind of precision she brought to the work, the 4th revision of the brief, the walk across the east pasture before writing a word of the supplement, the county notices left where Cobb could reach them without a word said to anyone, that was not what slow looked like. He said it was what very careful looked like. And he had run this operation long enough to know the difference between a person who could not do the work and a person who would not cut a corner. And he had never met anyone who would not cut a corner the way she would not cut a corner. The light had dropped to just a thin gold line along the upper ridge. She looked at it for a moment, and he kept his eyes on the road. She said Breck. He looked at her. She said she was not going anywhere. He said he had hoped she was going to say that. He said Calla. When she said his name, Breck, the word held everything she had come to understand about him across 2.5 months. It held the way he read the documents she put in front of him, slowly and without pretending he had understood a thing he had not understood, asking his questions plainly and listening to the answers with the same attention he gave the land and the weather and the condition of the herd. It held the way he had stood in the office doorway when Cobb was on the stool with the county notices and said nothing and gone back out, because he understood that the right response to a thing done well was to leave it alone. It held the patient work of 2 decades on a piece of land he had decided was worth building, the 220 acres grown to 480 by the refusal to cut corners. And the way he had sat beside her at the county hearing without saying a word because she had made it so nothing needed to be said, and he had known that and trusted it. She had known for most of November that she was saying his name in some interior way long before she said it on the road. It was the sum of everything she had seen him be, held in one syllable, and she said it once and meant all of it. When he said her name, Calla, the word held 2.5 months of watching her work and understanding, incrementally, what he was watching. It held the 7-inch stack addressed in a week, and the east pasture saved, and the promissory note properly discharged, and Lester Cord turned back in the yard, and the county examiner citing her documentation in the ruling. It held the fingerless gloves and the coat purchased without asking anyone, and the county notices placed on the corner of the table in the fore. Revisions that were each made not because the prior version was wrong, but because she would not let anything she put her name to be less precise than it could be. It held the $11 in the letter, which he held against Whitmore as a judgment the man would never know had been rendered, and the 9 years of documents signed by someone else, and the reply letter he had read 3 times. It held everything she was, which was the kind of person who walked the land before she wrote about the land, and he had known since October that this was the rarest thing, and that he had found it here by a combination of luck and the good sense to run an honest advertisement. She said she was not going anywhere, that she had known the east pasture from the first week, and known what the boundary survey discrepancy would eventually cost, and known the promissory note was a quiet risk waiting to become a loud one, and she had known, before she had any right to know it, that this was what the other work had been preparation for. The Carver Valley. The south pasture out the office window. The list on the kitchen table every morning, and the man across from it who asked his questions plainly, and never once made her feel that knowing the answer was anything other than exactly what the situation required, as if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. The wagon came into the yard in the last of the winter light, and Pete Garrow came out to take the horses, and looked at the two of them and said nothing, which was characteristic of Pete Garrow and suited them both. She got down from the wagon and went inside, and he came in behind her, and she already had the kettle on the stove. Neither of them was going anywhere, and the matter was settled, and the east pasture was whole, and the stack on the table would be smaller by morning, and the south pasture would be there in the light when it came, and both of them were staying, and it held.